When you see someone training relentlessly under the blazing sun, sitting for hours at their desk, tackling a complex problem, or staying focused on a goal for years without deviating, you may feel a mixture of admiration and doubt. Deep inside, you might quietly think they're extraordinary, as if that perseverance and focus were some kind of genetic gift, something they were born with in their very blood. We often explain other people's exceptional abilities as God-given talents to justify why we're not like them, to give ourselves a reason not to push as hard. But neuroscience tells a different story. The ability to work hard with focus, with consistency, and with endurance is not an inborn trait, but a skill that can be trained. Just like you can train your cardiovascular system, strengthen your muscles, or improve your ability to breathe deeply, your brain too can be rewired, optimized, and reshaped based on the type of stimulation you give it. And in this case, the stimulation is effort. Why does this matter so much? Because once you understand that perseverance isn't a talent, but a neural response that can be trained, you'll stop viewing hard work as an enemy. Instead, you'll start learning how to redesign the way your brain responds to challenges. And the first step in doing that is understanding how effort and reward are processed in the brain. At the heart of this process lies a molecule almost everyone has heard of, dopamine. People often talk about dopamine as the pleasure chemical, but that description is incomplete. Dopamine isn't just the feeling of joy when you've achieved something. More accurately, it is the chemical of pursuit, of motivation, of the anticipation of achieving something meaningful. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning, what keeps you moving even when you haven't reached the goal yet, what makes you hunger for a worthy challenge. And here's the key insight. Dopamine doesn't just spike when you cross the finish line. It surges most powerfully during the process of striving toward your goal. This is a truth that, once internalized, can change your entire perspective on labor, perseverance, and motivation. You'll stop waiting for rewards only at the end of the road. You'll realize that your brain can receive rewards at every grueling step, as long as you learn to link dopamine to the effort itself, not just to the result. This isn't a vague theory. It's been clearly demonstrated in neuroscience studies. In a classic experiment, scientists gave mice two options: one lever that released food easily, and another that was harder to press and required more effort. When their dopamine levels were artificially stimulated, the mice began to choose the harder lever because in their rewired nervous system, effort itself had become the reward. And for humans, the same principle applies. When you learn to redefine effort as a sign of growth, your brain begins to shift its response mechanism. It no longer treats difficulty as a threat. Instead, your nervous system begins to move toward the challenge because it understands that this is the zone where intrinsic reward awaits. So the question is, how can you, right in the middle of this chaotic life, start training your brain to enjoy effort rather than fear or avoid it? The answer begins with something simpler than you think: intentional self-talk. What you whisper to yourself when facing adversity is not just a feeling, it's a chemical rewiring tool. If you say to yourself, "This is hard, but this is where I grow," or "This feeling means I'm getting stronger," your brain listens and it begins to release more dopamine during the process, not just upon success. And when you repeat this enough, those neural circuits become reflexive. It's no longer forced effort. It becomes a biological habit. Think of it as a kind of strength training for your nervous system. Every time you push past laziness, every time you don't quit in the face of difficulty, you're not just completing a task, you're reshaping your brain to reward effort with dopamine without waiting for the final outcome. And once this loop is established, you'll start working hard, not out of pressure, not out of fear, but because the effort itself has become something you crave. But let's be clear, enjoying effort doesn't mean it will always feel comfortable. A vital part of this adaptation is learning to experience discomfort differently. You'll begin to separate discomfort from suffering. You'll realize that tension, fatigue, stress, these are no longer signs to stop, but data points showing you that you're in the growth zone. And that's the first threshold of transformation, understanding that hard work is not the skill of the extraordinary, but a neural response you can retrain yourself to develop starting today. Try reimagining the life cycle of a hardworking individual. It begins with a goal, followed by intense labor, enduring fatigue, and finally a reward. In this traditional view, dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and pleasure, is seen as the final gift you receive if you are persistent enough. But neuroscience reveals a completely different mechanism. Dopamine is not just released at the finish line. On the contrary, it is activated more powerfully during the actual process of striving. Every step you take toward a goal, every time you choose to continue instead of quitting, your nervous system sends a signal. Keep going, this is something valuable. This changes everything about how we perceive effort. If you learn how to associate dopamine with the process itself, instead of only the eventual reward, your brain will begin to enjoy taking action. You will no longer wait for success to feel happy. You will feel fulfilled in each moment of getting closer to what you desire. This is not just theoretical. In neuroscience studies on animals, when dopamine levels were artificially elevated, the mice didn't choose the easier path to receive a reward. On the contrary, they willingly exerted more effort, choosing the lever that required greater effort, because the act of striving itself had become the reward. The same is true for humans. When you learn to redefine effort as a marker of progress, your brain will no longer react to difficulty as a threat, but rather as a welcome signal. This explains why some people feel more fulfilled the more they work. It's not necessarily about money, fame, or praise, but because the very act of trying, struggling, and pushing limits is enough to activate dopamine. And that is a biological mechanism you can completely redesign within yourself. But this process doesn't happen randomly. It starts with being consciously present in each moment you face a challenge. If you tell yourself, every time I push past the urge to stop, I am rewiring my reward system, then within a few weeks, you will start to feel real transformation. Your brain will begin to crave effort instead of avoiding it. And this doesn't just change your behavior, it reshapes your entire neural identity. You're no longer someone who needs to be pushed to act. You become someone who takes action because deep down, your brain has learned to see effort as joy. You can spend hours working, sweat it out in the gym, or sit alone late into the night chasing your dreams. But what matters more than any of those actions is how you speak to yourself in those hard moments. Inner language, the quiet whispers in your mind whenever you feel tired, discouraged, or shaken, is not just a stream of thoughts. It is one of the most powerful tools to reprogram your nervous system and change how your brain perceives effort. When you say to yourself, I'm not sure I can do this, or this is too much, your brain registers those messages as threats, triggering avoidance responses and making it exponentially harder to keep going. But if you change your inner language to, this feeling is normal because I'm growing, or this is the moment I'm being shaped, you're not just soothing your mind, you're triggering a real biochemical shift inside your brain. Neuroscience research shows that positive self-talk during effortful moments can activate dopamine release right then and there without needing to wait until the goal is reached. And once dopamine appears during the work itself, it signals to the brain, this is worth it, keep going. The repetition of this experience, consciously and consistently, gradually forms a new loop in which effort is no longer tied to a sense of pressure or fear, but becomes an act that your body desires to repeat. You're not just doing the work, you're training your nervous system to love the work. And the best part is, you don't need any special tools or complex learning methods to begin this restructuring. You simply need to pay attention to the very first thing you say to yourself when facing difficulty, because in that moment, you're standing at a fork in the road. One path leads to the old reflexes of procrastination, avoidance, and exhaustion. The other is the path you consciously choose, where every internal sentence becomes a dopamine trigger, pushing you forward. Remember this, the words you speak to yourself are neural code. And if you write the code correctly, your brain will no longer need to be convinced each time. It will begin to crave the effort. And when that happens, You'll enter a new state where action is no longer an internal battle, but a reflex of a self that has been fully rewired from within. There is a truth that few people talk about. The most resilient individuals don't persevere because they feel no pain, but because they've learned to see pain as a signal, not something to avoid, but something to harness. In neuroscience, we call this the neuroplasticity zone, the region where the brain has the highest capacity to adapt, to learn quickly, and to change deeply. But to enter this zone, you must step outside your comfort zone and immerse yourself in what we call the just hard enough space. Not so easy that you become passive, but not so overwhelming that your nervous system goes into defensive mode. It is at this delicate boundary between stability and challenge that the brain begins to listen. And pain, fatigue, and pressure, these no longer serve as obstacles, but as neurological data. What does this mean? It means the tightness you feel during training, the confusion when facing a new problem, or that inner voice telling you to quit, none of these are inherently negative. They become biological indicators signaling that you are in exactly the right zone for growth. And if you can remain calm in that space, if you breathe deeply, maintain your focus, and resist impulsive emotional reactions, your nervous system begins to decode the message, this is adaptation. This is where I need to grow stronger. Just as muscles need tension to develop, the brain needs these threshold moments to rebuild its structure. It's not easy to stay calm in discomfort, but this very ability, the capacity to stay still in the presence of pain, is the foundation for turning pain from an enemy into a guide. You stop reacting instinctively and start responding by design. You no longer shrink from pressure signals, but expand into them. And in that very state, you enter the deepest realm of transformation, where the brain doesn't merely adapt temporarily, but begins to rewire its entire neural network. What once overwhelmed you becomes familiar ground. What once intimidated you becomes a rhythm you can walk with. And step by step, day by day, each time you patiently move through discomfort, you're not just overcoming challenges, you are reconstructing a stronger version of yourself from within your biology. Pain does not disappear, but it no longer scares you. It becomes a door. And you, with a nervous system renewed, are the one who walks through it. If you've ever found yourself easily distracted, struggling to maintain attention, or quickly drained when engaging in deep work for long periods, this says nothing about your worth as a person. It only reflects one thing. You haven't yet trained your focus system. In neuroscience, focus is not an innate trait reserved for a gifted few. It is a skill, and like any skill, it can be trained, strengthened, and expanded over time. Focus is a mental muscle, and just like in sports, the only way to strengthen it is to place it under tension, but not to the point of breaking. This requires a strategic approach where you build your attention like a workout plan. Start with short sessions, eliminate distractions, stay present, and gradually increase duration and complexity. Each time you hold your attention a little longer, you're recalibrating the way your nervous system processes information. Every time you choose to return to the task instead of reaching for your phone, you're reinforcing a specific neural pathway in your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, planning, and perseverance. Science calls this the focus-reward loop. When you sustain full attention on a task, whether reading, working, training, or solving a problem, your brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, begins to release a small amount of dopamine. It's a subtle reward that gives you a sense of progress, and if you maintain this habit regularly, your nervous system begins to understand that focus is worth it, a behavior of value. Gradually, you'll find yourself entering a state of deep work where time seems to disappear, distractions lose their appeal, and you feel as if you're flowing with the very act of doing. That state in neuroscience is called flow. And it is not a matter of luck. It is the result of a nervous system trained to love focus. And the most beautiful part is you don't need to wait for inspiration to step into this state. You only need to begin. Each time you enter your work with a clear intention, a quiet space, and a determined presence, you are sending a signal to your brain. This is a place for deep work. And when you repeat that day after day, your neural loop begins to take shape. Focus is no longer something you have to strive for. It becomes your neurological default. And from there, deep effort, rather than exhausting you, becomes the very place where you find joy, meaning, and even freedom. On the journey to building deep, sustainable work capacity, many people focus solely on effort while overlooking an equally essential component: recovery. What's surprising is that in neuroscience, rest is not merely a pause, but an integral part of strengthening and optimizing neural connections. If effort is the push that moves you forward, then recovery is the foundation that allows you to go farther, longer, and with greater precision. And not all rest is created equal. Only when rest is intentional does the brain truly recognize it as a signal for repair. When you work hard, your nervous system activates a host of neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, to maintain alertness and focus. But if you don't know how to close that cycle with a state of deep rest, the neural regions responsible for motivation and endurance begin to weaken, leading to burnout, loss of interest, and fragmented attention. This is why non-stop hustle is not a sign of discipline, it's the symptom of a system. On the contrary, when you follow deep work with proper rest through quality sleep, meditation, intentional breathing, or states of non-sleep deep rest, such as soft eye gazing and bodily relaxation, you are teaching your nervous system something critical. Effort is not a constant state. It is part of a closed loop cycle. And this awareness allows your brain to return to work faster with greater stability and renewed drive. Imagine you're sending a message to your nervous system after each work cycle. Tension is temporary and I know how to recover. That message not only calms the mind, it recalibrates your internal physiology. The brain regions responsible for flexibility, creativity, and problem solving become sharper when your system knows that restoration is guaranteed after each round of stress. And when this process is repeated often enough, the brain starts forming a new neural habit. The deeper the effort, the more it craves quality recovery. And in doing so, the entire cycle of effort, rest, renewal becomes seamlessly closed. Rest, when practiced with mindfulness and intention, is not weakness, it is strategy. It's how you build a nervous system that not only withstands pressure, but bounces back stronger. And within those quiet moments, you're not just recharging physically, you're preparing for the next version of yourself. A version not ruled by fatigue, but guided by an internal rhythm designed with intelligence and humanity. Every action you take silently sends a signal to your brain, not only about what you're doing, but about who you are becoming. Each time you choose to continue rather than give up, each time you take another step in silence and fatigue, you are engraving a powerful affirmation into your nervous system. I am someone who endures and persists. This isn't just symbolic. In neuroscience, identity isn't some abstract, unchangeable essence. It is a collection of neural circuits reinforced through repeated behavior. You don't need to wait until you're good enough to believe in yourself. You only need to act as if you already are that person. And with enough repetition of resilient behaviors, that identity will gradually become your default. The brain learns through emotionally charged experience. When you overcome a challenge that once defeated you, and then tell yourself, I did it, you are associating that victorious emotion with the act of endurance. The nervous system remembers. So the next time you face a similar situation, you won't start from zero. You'll begin from lived experience, from an identity embedded in action. And if you keep repeating this one instance at a time through small daily victories, finishing a writing task, completing a workout, replying to a tough email, then over time, you no longer have to convince yourself that you are strong. You know you are because your brain has been trained to believe it through a consistent stream of real evidence. Once this identity is programmed, it becomes a mental foundation in your hardest moments. You no longer measure yourself by fleeting emotions. You act based on an inner value system solidified through lived practice. And that is what distinguishes the temporary from the enduring. Not a difference in talent, but a difference in the depth of identity shaped through deliberate persistence. You don't need anyone to prove it to you, because once you have endured, taken that step, and repeated it again and again, you've created a new definition of yourself, not through words, but through neural wiring, not through hope, but through habit. And once that identity is established, challenges are no longer threats to avoid. They become invitations to embody the person you've consciously chosen to become. In the process of building a nervous system that thrives on effort, we often focus on willpower, discipline, and personal choices. But there's a quieter, less talked about factor that plays a decisive role in whether you move forward or stay stuck. Your environment, the space you live in, the people you interact with daily, and even the tiny rituals you repeat without noticing. All of these are neural signals, and when arranged intentionally, they can become powerful levers that help you sustain momentum, maintain focus, and stay deeply connected to your long-term goals. The brain is highly sensitive to repeated signals. A tidy workspace, a familiar lamp, a specific playlist, when consistently paired with focused effort over time, create a conditioned neural association. Each time you sit in that same spot, under that same light, with that same sound, your brain understands. It's time to get serious, to begin, to enter deep work. And it doesn't require willpower. It becomes a biological reflex. This is what we call ritual-based priming, activating neural pathways through familiar rituals. Similarly, the people around you form a living psychological environment. The brain learns not only from personal experience, but also from social observation through mirror neurons. If you regularly spend time around people who are lazy, constantly complain, or procrastinate, your brain will gradually adapt to how they respond to the world. But if you intentionally surround yourself with people who value effort, respect discipline, and see challenges as growth opportunities, your nervous system will begin to synchronize with that rhythm of life. There's no need to compare. Just being in the presence of that frequency is enough. That's why designing your environment, both physical and social, is a strategic move, not to control yourself, but to direct yourself. Start small, a quiet, distraction-free corner, a consistent time block for deep work, a simple pre-work ritual like making tea, turning off your phone, or writing a one-line commitment. These small acts, when repeated, become behavioral activation cues. And at some point, you won't have to force yourself into work mode. Your environment will do it for you. Through this repetition, you're not just building habits, you're constructing a neural system with direction, guided by signals you've consciously curated. From there, focus becomes natural, effort becomes easier, and growth becomes inevitable. There's something often overlooked when talking about discipline and resilience. Effort doesn't arise from willpower alone. It's deeply biological. Your brain doesn't function in isolation. It responds directly to sleep quality, morning light exposure, breathing rhythms, body temperature, blood sugar stability, and even the microenvironment you're exposed to daily. When these factors are off balance, you don't just feel tired. You're literally operating with a depleted, sluggish, and inefficient nervous system. And in that state, no amount of personal development planning can compensate for the biological disadvantage your body is under. If you want to fall in love with effort, you must first make effort biologically feasible. That means equipping your nervous system with the foundational conditions it needs to operate at its best. Morning sunlight exposure doesn't just wake you up, it resets your circadian rhythm, balances cortisol and melatonin levels, improves focus during the day, and enhances deep sleep at night. Quality sleep doesn't just restore physical energy. It's when your brain consolidates neural connections formed during the day. In other words, when you learn how to rest well, you double the effectiveness of your willpower training. In addition, seemingly simple tools like controlled breathing, especially slow exhalation, can regulate your autonomic nervous system, helping you stay calm under stress, stabilize your heart rate, and reduce the reactive impulse to quit when facing difficulty. Managing sugar intake, maintaining nutritional balance, hydrating properly, and limiting overstimulation from caffeine or screens at night all contribute to a stable biological environment where effort can arise naturally rather than being blocked by internal exhaustion. The beauty is, you don't need to do everything perfectly all at once. Just one small change, going to bed an hour earlier, spending 10 minutes outside in the morning light, or practicing slow breathing during tense moments, can significantly improve how your brain responds to challenging tasks. And once your body's nourished and supported the right way, you'll notice something shift. Effort no longer feels like a battle. It becomes a natural response of a nervous system that's been trained and cared for intentionally. That's when you realize you're not just doing more, you're going deeper with greater clarity and lasting energy. Effort then is no longer born of pressure, but of biological power awakened the right way. When you act with the same intention repeatedly over time, it doesn't just become a habit, it becomes you. Identity isn't formed in a single decisive moment, but through countless small choices made in silence, when no one is watching, when no one acknowledges your effort, and when there is no immediate reward. Every time you push through procrastination, every time you do the right thing, even when your mind wants to give up, you are sending a profound message to your nervous system. This is who I am becoming. And the brain, with its capacity to remember behavior and the emotions that accompany it, will gradually align your identity with the very choices you make each day. The beauty is that when that identity becomes deeply programmed, you no longer need to constantly convince yourself. You don't need to wrestle with lack of motivation or sit around waiting for inspiration to arrive. Action begins to initiate from within because the brain has come to see effort as a familiar state. This is the moment when the nervous system stops resisting hardship and begins to find meaning and wholeness within it. The consistent repetition of behaviors aligned with your long-term goals doesn't just create progress, it creates an entirely new version of you where identity, ability, and action are no longer separate, but fully integrated. From a neuroscience perspective, this process is called identity consolidation, the merging of identity through emotionally charged, repeated experience. It means that if you consistently link effortful actions with feelings of pride, with the image of the person you want to become, then each time that action is repeated, your nervous system records not just the result, but also the internal value you associate with that behavior. And gradually, you no longer see yourself as someone trying to change, but as someone who has already become one with that change. When identity and action are in harmony, you enter a state where difficult things are no longer something you have to endure. They become the arena in which you express who you are. You no longer question your capacity for perseverance because you've lived in its rhythm long enough for it to feel natural. Every step you take, every decision you make becomes living proof of an irreversible truth. You have evolved, not because life became easier, but because you became stronger, deeper, more resilient. And that is not just a result, it is the clearest expression of an identity built from within your nervous system, shaped moment by moment through your repeated choice to not give up